Correct. We're not. I was saying that was a unique situation. Friday. All right, 1 minute out. From 9-year-old girls in handcuffs to working professionals body slammed to the ground, for Black females in America, there's a different standard of justice. Today, we're talking to victims on police violence and the nation's leading experts. We're going behind the headlines to find out why Black girls and women suffer such abuse. And later in the show, I go one on one with police misconduct attorney and best selling author Andrea Ritchie to discuss her riveting book, Invisible No More. All coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report.
Whether they're preteens in elementary school or school teachers on their way to work, Black females are routinely subjected to a harsher standard of scrutiny in America. Their cases don't always make national news, but their stories of violent and sometimes lethal encounters with law enforcement will turn your stomach. From abuses of Native women protesting the Dakota Access Pipeline to Sandra Bland, Eleanor Bumpers, Kayla Moore, and Naila Elbey. Women and girls of color have been profoundly affected by racial profiling, unsubstantiated criminalization, and rampant abuse. We're going all in on the hidden epidemic of police brutality against historically vulnerable victims. Our first guest was brutally arrested following a routine traffic stop in Austin, Texas. Breaion King's his heroic and horrific experience became the subject of the Oscar-nominated film, The Traffic Stop.
My mom, she would tell me, you're my beautiful chocolate, baby. She was letting me know that in this world, people don't see your skin as beautiful. I'm a first generation college student. I'm the first to graduate with my master's, and I'm going to go get my doctorate. I never thought it would happen to me. I was pulled over by an officer, and I was sitting in my car.
Man, take a seat back in the car, please.
Ow! Oh my God!
Hold on, we're not going. Stand by. We're not going anywhere.
I don't trust you guys. Everything in me is fighting to get over it. You get over the physical, but it's getting over the spiritual and the mental. But I thank God that I'm alive to tell my story.
Good morning, Breaion.
Good morning.
I started the introduction and I called your violent encounter with those Austin police officers both heroic and horrific. And I did that because I think of you in a heroic sense because you survived that experience. Can you tell us just briefly what it was like to be, pulled out of your vehicle, body slammed to the ground over a simple traffic stop?
It was an out-of-body experience. It was very, very traumatic to me, both mentally, emotionally, physically, and also financially. I had a very, very hard time, and I'm still always going through the process of healing.
Yeah, we have some of that video from the dash cam from the officers. Just can you walk us through what happened? You're just driving on a road and you get routinely pulled over. What led to this encounter?
Honestly, the biggest thing was the fact that I asked him if he could hurry up. It became a control issue. It became, if you look in the video, he's okay with being in the car, talking to me, chilling. But as soon as I asked him if he could please hurry up, that's when he got upset. That's when he got angry.
So did you ask that question while you were in your vehicle or once you had stepped out of your vehicle?
When I was already in my vehicle, I said, okay, can you please hurry up?
Okay. So he was giving you a ticket or talking to you about the traffic violation and you asked him to hurry up.
Yes, ma'am.
And then after that, what did he then exit? How did you get out of your car?
After that, he got really, really angry. He got upset because I asked him if he could please hurry up. And then that's when he decided to go ahead and pull me out of the vehicle. When I asked him, please let me get out. I can get out myself. But it was control issue. He didn't like the fact that I asked him if he could hurry up. He didn't like the fact that I asked him if I could get out of the vehicle myself.
And I saw this photo of you talking about this incident, and you're so emotional. Tears are just streaming down your face. Can you just tell us, in that moment, what was going through your head? Did you think maybe you would die from this encounter?
Honestly, I did. I thought I was going to lose my life. It wasn't, even after the situation, it wasn't just a physical death. It felt like it became a spiritual death as well.
And we know that something really unusual happened. At one point, you're placed inside this police vehicle. You're in the back of the vehicle. And in your moment of torment, you somehow had the wherewithal to have a conversation with this officer. And I want to play a little of what that conversation sounded like.
Well, let me ask you this. Why are so many people afraid of black people?
That's what I want to figure out.
I can give you a really good idea why it might be that way. Violent tendencies. And I want you to think about that. I'm not saying anything. I'm not saying it's true. I'm not saying that I can prove it or nothing. But 99% of the time, when you hear about stuff like that, the black community that's being violent. That's why a lot of the white people are afraid, and I don't blame them. There's some guys I look at, yes, I know it's my job to deal with them, and I know it's probably going to go ugly, but that's the way it goes. But yeah, some of them, because of their appearance and whatnot, some of them are very intimidating.
It's really hard to listen to that, to think that this is someone talking in, the 21st century, calling African Americans them, using that pronoun when he's talking about African Americans, calling, black folks intimidating, talking about our appearances, talking about tendencies to be violent. So as you're having this conversation again, what's going through your mind as this officer is so blatantly demonstrating his racism?
Honestly, what went through my mind was I know the first thing was that I'm a good black person. It kind of took me aback because I really didn't believe that people still thought that way. And it just kind of let me know that the system is warped, because they need to understand that things have to be changed. Biases has to be changed, because Black people are not the most violent in the world. If you go back and you actually do your research, you see who has the most violent tendencies and who are the leading people and the leading race in violent tendencies. So for me, it kind of hurt growing up in a Black community, knowing that I have always been loved and have had a lot of people cover me in love. It hurt. It really did. It made me fearful for my community, because you have some people who have power issues, and then you don't know the hearts of anyone else. So you don't know if they are racist or not. So there are just a lot of different factors that we have to actually factor in.
Yeah, and let's just say that for the record, there is no scientific evidence that it's been disproven that African Americans have some kind of, violent, strain in our DNA. And we need only look at what happened at the Capitol on January 6th to, debunk any theory that Black people are somehow, more violent than any other race of people. It's very clear that all people can be at any given moment in time violent. So the fact that someone is that ignorant, that misinformed, has such stereotypes, but yet they are in a job. He's been hired to protect and serve. And his encounter with you as an African American woman, he's carrying that kind of, outdated, negative, pejorative stereotyping about Black people. No wonder the encounter that should have been simple, routine, escalated in the way that it did. Do you think that officer ever took into consideration that you look like you're, 110 pounds soaking wet, that you were this small female that he was manhandling in this way?
No, I do not believe that he took in consideration, because I was about 115 at the time. So yes, he didn't take in consideration that I was little and that I was tiny. But it's also the fact that it was a control issue.
And I know, Breaion, that you've since settled a civil rights lawsuit that you filed against the city. Kudos to you, because no doubt that was a clear violation of your civil rights. But I was struck by something the police chief said. The chief of this particular police department made a comment. But let's talk about the officer. We're going to talk about what the chief said. But the officer that was involved in that encounter, was he ever disciplined or terminated, to your knowledge?
He wasn't disciplined for my situation. However, moving forward, he did get in trouble because he kicked a Hispanic man while he was already on the ground, and then he lied about it. So that's why. So because I told my story, someone else was actually able to seek justice, and then that's why he was let go. However, the officer who drove me there never got reprimanded for what he said or his biases.
So the officer that we saw slam you to the ground was never terminated from that police department because of his treatment of you?
No, ma'am, not because of his treatment of me, but after review.
I think
treated his, the last person, that's what happened.
So I want to go back to that police chief. We have that headline where the police chief for that Austin Police Department said he was sickened, personally sickened by watching that video. Did you ever have a chance to talk with that police chief and learn about how he thinks about his police department?
No, ma'am, he never reached out to me personally.
And as a part of your settlement, was there any efforts made, or as a part of the settlement, was there anything mandated that would change in the way that the Austin police, handle these kinds of encounters?
Chief Officer Brian Manley, he's retiring. He has made conscious efforts to actually call the police department to a higher standard and to actually hold them accountable. So he did actually start implementing different programs to actually support the community, the Austin community, and especially the Black community, seeking justice for all.
It looks like you said, I know I've been reading a lot about your case, and looking at that video, again, I just want to know, that officer, the one you said that's having this conversation with you, who acknowledges his racism, nothing happened to him?
No, ma'am, nothing happened to him.
Wow. How did you get to this HBO? How did your story become an Oscar-nominated documentary?
The truth is, I have no idea. It was nobody but God, that just kind of covered me, because I've always had a desire to help people. And I wanted to make sure that everyone was okay. And so they just so happened to reach out to me. And my lawyer at the time, she asked me, do you think is it something that you want to do? And I asked her if it can help people. Yes, ma'am, I will do it.
And the reason we wanted to have you on this show is because the issue, of police violence against women continues to make headlines. So when you see those stories about the women who've had similar encounters where they're pulled out of their vehicles, where their body slammed, does that give you deja vu all over again in terms of what happened to you?
There were at times where it did trigger. It triggered a lot of different emotions and feelings within me. That's why I'm pro mental health and making sure that people go through and work through their trauma. So just seeing it, yes, I say, yes, ma'am. Sometimes I have a very, very hard time still dealing with it. However, I go through it and I push through it because I know there are other people who have gone through the things that I've gone through. And I know that hearing positive words and knowing that someone like me has also made it, that it'll give them strength to keep on pressing on as well.
I want to bring into this conversation Michelle Jacobs. She's a professor of law. She's a professor of law at the University of Florida, where she teaches criminal law and critical race theory. Good morning, Professor Jacobs.
Good morning. Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, absolutely. You've heard Breaion's story. You probably heard it before this morning. You've heard so many stories like that. Why do we keep seeing these stories in the news?
Well, the question is, do we keep seeing the stories in the news, right? The number of stories we see in the news pale in comparison to the number of Black women who are being subjected to police violence. So every now and again, a story will pop up into the news and we'll get a little bit of mileage from it for a while, but it always gets assumed to the issue of what's happening to Black men in terms of police violence. Not that that's not an important issue, it is, but the interaction with Black women and the police is sometimes very different from that of the interaction with Black men and the police.
Well, help us understand that, Professor Jacobs. Why is it that stories like Breaion's don't, capture the national news in a way that the stories about Black men? You're right. We see the stories of, whether it's George Floyd or Michael Brown or Philando Castile, and all of those stories are very worthy, and we don't want to suggest in any way that they should not, capture the nation's attention. But why is it that Black women and the stories of Black women aren't being told in the same way?
So there's quite a few reasons for that, actually. And I believe that they have to do with the historical views that our society has towards Black women, right? That Black women are not valued highly as people or as women. In addition to the fact, and I mentioned this before on media, that journalists can't sell ads based on what happens to Black women. You know, they can generate income off of the trauma of repeatedly showing a Black man being killed on TV. But how will they generate?
Professor Jacobs, stop for a minute. That's a really deep concept, but we can't glide over that. Because what you're saying is the killing of Black men tied up in that is something, and we got to call that out.
Yes, it's Black death for entertainment.
Yeah.
Right? Think about how many times they showed the killing of George Floyd on the news, no matter what kind of trauma that was creating for his family or for the Black community at large. But it gets eyes on the news, right? And that's what advertisers are looking for. If you're talking about Black women, advertisers don't care about what happens to Black women. It's not a way to generate any kind of income for profit. So our stories are not as important. One, because they don't value Black women, and then two, because you can't make any money off of it.
Do you, Breaion, when you hear Professor Jacobs, an expert, renowned expert in the field of race and police brutality, make that kind of bold pronouncement? How does that make you feel about, you as a woman who's gone through, not killed, thank God, that's why I called you your heroic experience, because your life was not taken in that encounter, even though it was violent. But how does that make you feel?
Honestly, it breaks my heart to know that people look down on us and they don't see us as valuable. And, like we hear Black Lives Matter, and I do believe all lives matter. We really do. We are human beings and we should be treated as such. And that's what the biggest issue is that with HBO, they humanized me. And that is what I'm grateful for, is that people got to see that I am a human being instead of just that violent encounter.
Professor Jacobs, is there any danger when we talk about how the media uses the footage of say like George Floyd's murder? Is there any danger that without showing that footage, we wouldn't get the kind of call to action, the focus on systemic racism that we've seen, in the aftermath of his murder? If we didn't have those vivid images, would we not be able to start addressing, some of the issues of police brutality?
So the images, of course, are important, as we've seen even from as far back as Rodney King. But the question is the ethical use of the images. Is it necessary to replay George Floyd being executed 10 times within a 10-minute window, right? That's the question. But there's no question that images help. For example, take this young child in Rochester who was pepper sprayed by the police. Mm-hmm. If police weren't required to have body cameras, and if municipalities weren't required to release the body camera footage, we wouldn't be aware of the level of violence that police use against children who are Black girls, right? So the images do matter. It's a question of how those images will be used. And in that particular case, the image that was portrayed to me was so significant because in the exchange between the officer and the girl, the officer says, "Stop acting like a child." Mm-hmm. And this little girl, this little Black girl, had the presence of mind to say, "I am a child," right? Yeah. She's trying to assert her humanity as a little girl. And it's a perfect example of something that we call adultification, which is a process by which mostly whites, but other members of communities as well, view Black girls as being adult-like. And so that's a tremendous problem, but it's a great example for the public to see that it doesn't just happen to adults like Miss King. It also happens to Black girls as young as 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years old.
No doubt about that. We have one of the mothers from Rochester whose daughter experienced something very similar coming up next in the show. I wanted to go back to Sandra Bland and Breonna Taylor because
Yes.
their cases captured the nation's attention, and we started to, say their name and talk more about these cases. Do you think, as a result of Sandra Bland and Breonna Taylor, cases getting so much national attention that there's starting to be a shift, I would say, in the way we think about women like Breaion King and others who have experienced violence by police, Black women?
So I do think maybe not as much for Sandra Bland because people still weren't on the pickup about what was happening to Black women with police violence. But surely with Breonna Taylor, the issue is now more in the public's eye. And it's always, the Black Lives Matter's co-founders have always tried to push the issue of police violence against Black women, but they've had some pushback on that, right? Not just from the media and from government, but also somewhat from the community as well. And so I think now the confluence of all of the things that are going on have made the time right for people to understand, yes, this is what's happening to Black women as well. The police do kill them as they do kill Black men. But the thing that's not getting talked about is the other types of police violence against Black women. For example, when police sexually assault Black women. So in this context, the woman doesn't die.
Right.
You don't get good media footage off of it. And because of the sexual assault nature of it, the identity of the victim may not even be known. Right. So we're not aware of the fact that Black women and girls are being sexually assaulted by the police. But this is a thing that happens, and it's a big issue. And hopefully we can draw that piece of it into the discussion as well, particularly as we're looking at police reform, to see if we can get the reform to cover those instances where women don't get killed.
Yeah, well, we don't have video and we don't have death, which is why your story, Breaion, is so important, because you're here to tell us about it. You're here to be the face of it. And you've been so incredibly brave to tell your story so publicly. Are you hopeful at all, given the last couple of years and particularly the last 6 months with the focus on systemic racism, police violence, and now a new administration in the White House that say they're going to make this a priority issue? Are you hopeful?
I am always hopeful because it has gotten a lot better throughout the years. However, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done.
Well, we've got to leave it there. Thank you so much, Breaion, for sharing your story. Thank you so much, Professor Jacobs, for joining us. Such a critical discussion, so much to talk about. As Breaion said, hopeful, but staying on the battlefield because there's so much work to be done on this issue. Again, thanks to both of you for joining me this morning. All right, if you were shocked by what happened to Breaion King, those images of her being thrown to the ground, body slammed to the ground, then you're going to be even more appalled by what happened to 10-year-old Naila, who is the daughter of Akilah Elbey. She was handcuffed and thrown into the back of a squad car by police officers in Rochester, New York. And her mom is here to tell us about that horrible story and that harrowing event that happened to her 10-year-old daughter. Good morning, Akilah.
Grand Rising, how are you, Areva?
I'm fantastic. I'm so sorry to hear what happened to your 10-year-old baby. And let's just call it what it is, because when you're 10 years old, you are still our little baby. So can you tell us, what happened to your daughter?
Well, like Breonna's case of a traffic stop, I wasn't present at the time when my daughter got arrested. She was in a car with my husband and my son and my other daughter-in-law. And we have been targeted for years, since 2011, since we have been learning about being an Indigenous person and trying to come out of the folds of the slave mentality that they have pretty much put on our people. And so as I started learning language, I started doing more research about the law because I didn't want to break the law. And when I started finding out that some of the laws that we are getting charged with are unconstitutional, I started challenging those laws along with my husband. And ever since then, we started getting targeted. We had been thrown in jail. And on this particular day, May 17, 2020, my daughter, Naila Bay, was arrested and handcuffed along with my husband, my son, and daughter-in-law
So I know you
for
were at the traffic stop, but do you know what caused the police to stop the car that had your husband and your kids in it?
well, as we can look at it, it looks like malicious intent. Basically, they were following them around, and so they use different traffic law infractions to pretty much pull them over on the highway, which these Rochester Police Department are only city municipality police. So them being on expressway should have been a statement's job, but they chose to act like they were highway statement and pull over this automobile while my son was he was the driver. And they asked him to give up his ID, but they mainly was asking my husband, who was the passenger. And because my husband was speaking and saying, hey, listen, I'm not the driver, talk to the driver. They said, we need your ID. And he gave him his diplomat ID. And so we're indigenous, more American. Some call us Rappahannock or Blackfoot, Chickasaw, Cherokee Moors. And he kept telling the officer, I'm a more American and I'm just want to exercise my diplomat immunity. And they started making jokes and saying, oh, you're a sovereign citizen and stuff like that. And that was kind of what escalated the situation to my daughter being arrested, because they wanted to use the sovereign citizen thing to make it seem like as if we were part of this white nationalist movement of people who actually are going against the law and who feel like they have the right to do whatever they want to do.
So let me ask you this, Akil, your daughter, I understand what you're saying. Your husband is having this conversation with the officer. Somehow it escalates and your daughter ends up actually in handcuffs. Is she taken to the police station?
Yes.
Is she in handcuffs and taken to the station?
Yes, I pulled up on the scene to come get my daughter. I told her to stay in the car while my husband got arrested and my son got arrested. So both of my daughters remained in the car. And when they was in the car, I said, stay in the car. So they're going to listen to me first, not thinking they're going to get arrested. And so the officers came back over to speak to them and tell them to get out the car because they were going to tow the car. And my daughter said, my oldest daughter, Sophia, said, please let us get out on our own. We don't want any men touching us because of our religious belief. We're Muslim, so we don't allow men to touch us. And so they said, get out now. They gave my daughter 5 seconds to get out the car, but they ripped her out in 1 second and they just threw her up against the car. My daughter was terrified, didn't know what was going on. And she's telling them like, please, like, you're hurting me. And the officer was like, well, stop resisting, so his whole thing was trying to put on her like she was resisting arrest. So when I came to the scene, the officer had already knew who I was. He asked me, are you mom? And I said,
when you get to the scene, is your daughter there still at the scene with the handcuffs on?
Yeah, she's in the back of the police car. She's in the back of the police car with on her knees, crying. And I asked him, I said, can you she's 10 years old. He says, are you mom? I say, yes. And he says, well, he starts putting his gloves on his hands. He says, if you don't back up, I'm going to get you for obstruction of governmental also. And I'm just like, well, what was her prior for her getting arrested? She's only 10. And he says she was obstructing a governmental. And that's something that they like to use on people, especially our people, in order to get a misdemeanor or get some kind of charge.
I want to bring now into this conversation Shalonda Jones. She's an activist in Rochester. She's with the Rochester Community Justice Initiative. Good morning, Shalonda.
Good morning.
I know you've been really active in Rochester, working on issues of police violence, police brutality, and you got involved in Akila's daughter's case. What got you involved in this particular case?
What got me involved, because first of all, I'm a mother. We have daughters who are the same age. And I began a platform on Facebook called Prayer Call with Shalonda. And I definitely wanted to get this story out because I knew that the police were completely in the wrong. Before even hearing, their side of the story, I just feel like there's no excuse for a 10-year-old child to have to face this trauma. So yeah, I committed myself to this issue when I heard about it.
And I know you've been active in the Justice Initiative in Rochester. Tell us what you guys have done to try to bring forth some change with the Rochester Police Department.
We have done different events. We had Justice for Naila event near the city hall, trying to get a hold of the mayor because she wasn't really talking to us. We weren't hearing anything from our leaders in our community. So we put on protests. We had many conferences and getting in front of the news and stuff like that, and getting in front of the police station and protesting because we had no other choice but to do these things because we weren't being heard. This was, if we had not continued to press on, it would have been swept under the rug. The issue just happened to a little Black girl.
And I'll go back to you, Akilah. Since this happened and since the advocacy and the protest and the work that Shalonda and her group have done, has anything changed, in your opinion, with respect to the Rochester Police Department?
Well, no, actually, they came in and targeted us again right after, where our children were taken away for education neglect so that they can not be held accountable for the actions that they just had. So on the 14th of January, my children were taken away for education neglect because I wouldn't vaccinate my children to go to school, but they were already enrolled in an online program. So they have been in foster care. Right now, they're not in my care. So we constantly have retaliation going on. So we're looking for the community and other people to assist us and make this a little bit bigger because it's just constantly, it looks like we're bad people, the way they're portraying everything, so that people will look at us as we're just not wanting to do the right thing. And working with community justice initiative, we all was trying to do things that can make the community a little bit better, but also protecting our children, because we see that the police officers can't protect us. We can't even go to them for assistance when we need help to get, if someone's committing a crime, because we're afraid that we're going to be the ones who are targeted.
Shalonda, I want to ask you, do you feel like the police department, did you guys get the kind of justice you were seeking as it relates to Naila's case?
Absolutely not. No. I remember we put on a big protest. It was for another reason. A young man named Tobias, who was a standby, and police beating up a Black man, and he was just there recording, and the police beat him up. So we were protesting about that. And those same officers that were on the scene that arrested Naila were trying to block the traffic and stuff for us. So it was like, how are these police officers still on the force and out here with us, And it was so emotional for Akilah. It was just, it was so hard to deal with. And then on top of that, we have the 9-year-old little girl. That just proves that, nothing has changed. They don't care, to turn around and do what they did to this 9-year-old little girl. It was just a slap in our face.
I know that, Shalonda, hold on. I want to ask Shalonda about this law. You're working on an actual law to get passed called Naila's Law. Tell us what the law would do if it does get passed in the
Yes, this is work that Community Justice Initiative that we're doing together. It will prevent our children from being handled with the police alone. So they would have to call a close family member, CPS, maybe some crisis team, to be on the scene to handle these children, because the police is not equipped to do that. They're too aggressive and they're angry at these Black girls for some odd reason. So it will make sure that this law will help our babies to be protected in the time of them being in interaction with the police.
What's the status of the law now?
As of right now, we had a protest and we did hand over information to legislation in Rochester, New York. So as of right now, we're hoping and praying that they're working on
the process
moving forward, doing what they said that they're going to do with it.
Akilah, for you, what do you want as justice for your daughter?
Well, we want redress and remedy. We've seen this situation happened over and over again. But on top of that, the same people who participate with assisting officers, they need to be reprimanded also. So like CPS, the city school districts, the hospitals, because they're all working together as a system that actually is not benefiting the people, because they're going to take the law enforcement's information first before they take the citizens' information. And so you don't get your full due process because it becomes biased, because everybody's looking at them as they're the heroes, they're the essential workers, and we're all a team, so we're going to work as a team. So we need to fix all of those areas and departments before they start, saying, hey, we want to put funding over here and over here, because when it comes down to money, we are the assets. We look like the big cash cow, and everybody wants a piece of us, and that's what it boils down to.
Do you want an apology from the Rochester Police Department?
I definitely want an apology from Rochester Police Department, also from the mayor, the city of Rochester, the city council, who has never reached out to me, the commissioner, Monroe County, Adam Bello. I've reached out to them, and also New York State Governor Cuomo, who actually passed this law saying that everyone has to be vaccinated, for the fact that magistrates here feel like they can now take control over who gets vaccinated, and they call themselves vaccinating my children without my permission, and we have a court order it.
Well, we've got to leave it there. Thank you so much, Akilah, for being willing to share your daughter's story. I wish her the best. Thank you so much, Shalonda, for the work you're doing in the community. It definitely takes a village, and thank you for supporting Akilah in her journey, because definitely moms need to support other moms. And again, thank you both for joining me this morning. Now I want to bring into this conversation an expert. She's been with us before when we were really focused on Breonna Taylor's case back in the fall of last year. Her name is Dr. Treva Lindsey. She's a professor in women's and gender studies at Ohio State University. Good morning and welcome back, Dr. Lindsey.
Good morning. Thank you for having me back.
Wow. We were talking about Breonna Taylor 3, 4, 5 months ago. You were on the show. And now today, the reason we're revisiting this whole topic is because of what's been in the news is not Breaion King recently, but it's stories of these young girls. It's not Breonna Taylor, who was 26 years old. It's Naila, who was 10 years old. And it's the other, young girl in Rochester that, has been mentioned earlier in the show, who was actually 9 years old. Just help us understand how a police officer rides up on a scene, sees a 9-year-old, 10-year-old girl, and somehow that little girl ends up in handcuffs. And in the case of this recent incident that just happened a couple of weeks ago in Rochester, not just handcuffed, but pepper sprayed. What's going on with our police, officers across this country?
Yes, such a hard question, in that it is such an emotionally exhausting thing to watch as a Black woman, watching these cases unfold, watching these videos come out, hearing the audio of this come out, and that our Black girls are subjected to the horror, the death dealing, the assault, the violence of anti-Blackness. And that coupled with what we know to be misogynoir, which is a certain kind of anti-Black misogyny that is also impacting and affecting how Black girls are seen in the world. Earlier, when Professor Jacobs was on here talking about the adultification of Black girls that we see. So in addition to all of the ways that anti-Blackness operates with regards to policing and criminalizing, with Black girls, what we also see is this adultifying process that allows for these aggressive, violent encounters that absolutely attempts to nullify the humanity of these Black girls, the personhood of these Black girls. They're not afforded the innocence and the joy of childhood. They are seen as criminalized Black people.
I want to play some of that video from this 9-year-old girl, the little girl in Rochester, that her story has made headlines. Let's listen to some of that video and audio from her encounter with police.
Then get in the car. You're acting like a child. I want to stop. I got a bad Just spray her. Just spray her at this point. Stop! There. got her. I got her.
Please, wipe my eye! Wipe my eye, please!
That video is so hard because you hear her screaming for her dad. You hear her saying, the officer in such a ridiculous way says, "Stop acting like a child." And the 9-year-old has to tell this idiot, "I am a child." He sprays her and she's crying. She's saying, "My eyes." I mean, the video is just like every horror you can imagine happening to a kid is encapsulated in those like 40 seconds.
It is devastating. I had attempted to avoid the video even when I heard the description of it. And when I heard that particular line of him telling her to stop acting like a child and her screaming in the ways of Black girls knowing that they don't have that access in the mind of white supremacy, in the mind of anti-Blackness, access to the narrative of childhood, access to the narrative of innocence, someone who will call out for their father as they're being violently assaulted, and the callousness with which he engages her throughout the entire encounter. There's not one moment when he engages her as though she's a human being, a person who is hurt, let alone a young person who's being hurt, who's being assaulted, who's being criminalized, who's being violated. There's a trauma that's being baked in that very moment that she is now a part of that. And that video exists for all of us, and we're consuming it as part of this archive of evidence of all of the ways that the criminalization and violation of Black girls unfolds every day. It would be notable if this were exceptional, but the sad and devastating truth is that it's not.
Yeah. There's some new details emerging too that again shows the disturbing conversations between the officer in that case and this girl as she's screaming for her father. He says to her that she brought this on herself, and he calls her hun. There's so many parts about the story that really frustrate and anger me, but a grown man calling this little girl hun, you might say that to your woman, your girlfriend, your wife. Why is this grown man referring to her in that way? And I think back, and you can speak to this, Professor Lindsey, about the sexualization of young girls. How does that play into this treatment that we're seeing, these violent encounters that they're having with police officers?
Absolutely. I mean, this also plays into that adultification that we hear when we talk about Black girls. And part of adultification, if we're adultifying Black girls into Black women, we know the existing racist and sexist stereotypes about Black women being hypersexual and lascivious and promiscuous, right? There are these ideas that they are sexually available, they are sexual objects. And so there's a disregard, again, for their personhood that comes along with this. So in addition to being seen not as a child, but as an adult, and then as a Black woman adult, a Black female adult, they're then also seen as someone who can be sexualized, who can be fetishized, who can be engaged in a particularly egregious way. And so that offhand hun is part of that adultification and also part of this Black girl being placed in this longer history of Black women's sexuality being demonized and being targeted and further criminalized as well. So she's at the intersection of both the stereotypes about Black women as well as the stereotypes about Black girls. And while they're interconnected, it's so fascinating to see in this one act of violent criminalization that these two overlap in this way, and both are present.
I'm sure you've seen this Georgetown Law study that their Center on Poverty did, and they did this report they called The Erasure of Black Girls. And this incident we're talking about in Rochester reflects the problem with how police treat Black girls. And they call out this term, adultification bias. And you've said it, Professor Jacobs have said it, but I don't think, everyday people walking around understanding, or many people have never even heard the term adultification or this notion of adultification bias. So I think we should, let's just assume people are just hearing this term for the first time. Was it developed? Well, help us understand how it was developed and how it's being applied in these cases involving these Black girls.
So to understand adultification is to understand the processes by which we assign accountability, responsibility, and understand where someone is along kind of the evolution of from childhood to adulthood. And so there's a tendency to accelerate how we think about Black girls along that spectrum of childhood to adulthood. So adultification in this means that you are more responsible for your actions, have less proximity to innocence, you have less proximity to being able to make certain kinds of mistakes without there being significant consequences. And it also means a sense of knowing what we think that these individuals know and their maturity with regards to that knowledge. And so there's a perception that Black girls know more about sex, know more about the world, know more about all kinds of systems and things that we would not normally expect a child to know. But because of racism and misogyny, we have this expectation, so many of us, and a lot of this is unconscious, but certainly in this instance, you see a conscious iteration of it when he says you're acting like a child as though she's not a child. So you see it in real time. Most cases, you don't have something that operates like that, but you see engagement between, for instance, police officers or school resource officers and Black girls that would suggest that they are holding these young people more accountable for their actions than their white counterparts and violently engaging them in different ways because of that adultification process.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the issue of school resource officers, because that was my next question for you is this adultification process, this phenomenon that we see, does it exist outside of law enforcement? And we have seen just this barrage of stories involving kids and school officers, where school officers are ripping kids from their desks, they're throwing kids to the ground. Again, they're putting kindergarten students in handcuffs. So outside of law enforcement being police and then school officers, do we see this process anyplace else in any other system?
Absolutely. As mentioned earlier, we absolutely see this in our school system. And here, of course, I love to cite the tremendous work of Monique Morris and thinking about the push out and the criminalization of Black girls in schools. And so we often frame things as the school to prison pipeline, that's what we're trying to interrupt. Well, even that framework indicates that the school is somehow the safe place, when in fact, we know that we're seeing our Black girls disciplined more harshly in school. So 3 times the suspension rate of their white counterparts. We're seeing them isolated in schools. We're seeing school resource officers engage them more aggressively. All of these things are happening. And as you mentioned, and even ages as young as kindergarten, school ages as young as kindergarten age students, where we're seeing this disciplining happening. And so that disciplining is undergirded by a criminal punishment system that so often our Black girls then enter as a result of these disciplinary practices within schools, and having police presence, law enforcement presence within our schools that see the behavior of Black girls as transgressive. So you can't be loud, which kids are. You can't talk back, which kids do. You can't ask questions, because then you on one hand, perhaps you're read as precocious if you're white, and if you're Black, it's seen at times as disrespectful and therefore needing to be disciplined. And that discipline leads to punishment. And so are our schools really safe? And I'm not just talking about from gun violence and the normal ways that we talk about school safety, but actually the people who are charged with protecting, serving, and teaching our kids are also investing in these problematic and criminalizing narratives about Black girls.
So they would suffer from what this report calls this adultification bias. And I guess even equally alarming to me in reading about this was even in the Children's Protective Services, places where foster kids go to be adopted out, to be placed with foster parents, that this bias exists, even as you think about Black kids being adopted out of the system. This notion being that somehow Black kids are more independent, that they're less needing of nurturing, they're less needing of being parented. How widespread do you see this happening, even in like the foster care system or the child protective agency system that is, again, there to protect children?
Yes, I mean, the bigger issue is that all of these systems are interconnected. As both Akila and Shalonda, when they were on earlier, were talking about all of the systems that are accountable for these failures, that we see this in the foster care system, we see this in the adoption system, we see this in our school system. These are interlocking things, and they're all working together around certain ideas and stereotypes and tropes and damaging and dehumanizing narratives about Black girls. So whereas it may seem really cool to say a Black girl is independent and more mature for her age, or even precocious, often what that means is that she's not in need of the same kind of care or nurturing or love or presence or engagement as her white counterparts. And that is just an ugly untruth. And it does nothing to remedy how these systems replicate anti-Blackness and misogyny and harm towards Black girls. It actually embeds an anti-Black girl bias that is throughout all of these systems. And at different points, law enforcement is engaged in these different systems. And so if Black girls don't comport to some ideal of how to do girlhood, then there's often repercussions that are long lasting, whether that's being placed in the system, whether that's your parents being criminalized for their treatment of you, or you being violated and handcuffed and placed into the back of a car as you're struggling through an emotional moment, right? This also speaks to kind of ableism in Black girls, which we tend to see a lot of that intersection with our inability to deal with mental health in Black girls in substantive and meaningful ways as well.
Yeah, and we see it play out in the medical system. We've done some shows on Black infant mortality rates. We've done shows on, Black women in the healthcare system. And obviously there, again, this bias that somehow Black, women don't, have a higher threshold of pain. We know when we go to the doctor, we're not likely to be believed. We just did a show on autism and how Black women, when they go to report developmental issues with their kids, they're not believed. And it delays actually the diagnosis of Black kids who have autism by as much as 3 years because the parents, the mothers primarily, are not being listened to. So when you talk about this being interconnected into so many systems, we talked about the criminal justice system, we talked about the prison system, the school system, the healthcare system. It's mind-boggling when you think about how these stereotypes, and even with Breaion earlier in the show, she said this conversation she's having with the white officer, he's saying to her that Black people have more violent tendencies. So here we are in 2015, 2016, a white officer in Austin, Texas, not the smallest, most backwards place. Some people would say a pretty metropolitan, sophisticated city, is saying that Black people somehow by their DNA, by our nature, have more violent tendencies. We're going to run out of time in a minute, Professor Lindsey. So now we've got to talk about solutions. How do we change? How do we debunk? How do we dispel these really, really pernicious stereotypes that continue to permeate, these systems that we're talking about this morning?
Right. I mean, some of this is we are deeply invested as a nation in anti-Blackness in every way. And I think divesting from that is, again, we're engaging and learning all of the ways that we are. So it shows up in the medical system. It shows up in the ways that we handle Black girls. It shows up in the ways that we refuse care and deny pain to Black folks. But I think a concrete step as it pertains to Black girls, for instance, is thinking about policing in our schools. And I think this is a really important issue that we have to tackle head on about, one, why we have police in schools in the first place. Who is that protecting and serving? And who is that devastating by that presence? How do we talk about this at a broader scale as we're having conversations around defund the police? What that conversation is asking us is, what are we invested in and who are we protecting and serving with the services that are available? And why is the criminal punishment system such a well-funded part of our society, as opposed to these systems that are deeply protective, nurturing, and caring for, and attuned to the ways that injustice and disparities play out on a day-to-day basis? That's what we need to be funding, not systems that are built upon maintaining those narratives, maintaining those stereotypes, because we reinvest in those stereotypes every time we reinvest in systems that are built upon them.
And I understand that, and I would agree with you 100%. rethinking about safety and schools and what the role of a school officer is. And one of the things that was really disturbing to me about one of the videos I saw of a girl being arrested and handcuffed in a school, the officer was there, but there was also an educator or a school administrator who was there as well and was in many ways complicit in what was happening. So I didn't see the adult saying to the officer, no, she doesn't need to be handcuffed. We should handle this a different way. She was actually, going along with this process of criminalizing this little girl. So it's
Right.
not just the officers, and we need to call that out. It's not just the hired safety officers. It's reimagining the adults who work in school systems as well, and their
Yes.
connection to those police officers that are on those campuses. But is there anything else? And I know this is a huge issue,
Yes.
and folks like you spend your lives working on these issues, so we are internally grateful for you. But I'd have to think that in this era, in this 2021, with Joe Biden and Kamala Harris in the White House, you know, is there a way that we start to change some of these stereotypes that have created these systems and that sustain these systems?
I mean, one of the challenges here is that often this burden is put on Black girls, girls of color, Indigenous folks of color to do something other than exist as human beings moving through the world. And that commitment, as we said, to unlearning and divesting from white supremacy, from anti-Blackness, from anti-indigeneity, for me, often begins with divesting from